You're running late, the elevator doors are open, nobody else is waiting to get in, and you jab the closed door button like your life depends on it. Nothing happens. You press it again, harder this time, as if force is the missing ingredient. Still nothing. The doors close on their own, eventually, at exactly the same pace they always do. Like your finger was never even on that button. That's not bad luck. That's not a broken elevator. That's happening in almost every office building, apartment complex, and hospital on the continent, at the exact same moment, to millions of people who have no idea why. Think about this. You've ridden in hundreds of elevators, old ones with brass buttons worn smooth by decades of fingers, new ones with touchscreens and soft chimes, different buildings, different cities, different years since they were installed. But almost every single one of them has that same small button with two triangles pointing at each other, and almost every single time, pressing it does absolutely nothing. Why does nearly every elevator on the planet have a button that appears to do nothing at all? Not a light switch, not a call button in the hallway, not any of the other controls on that same panel. This one specific button, worn shiny by more anxious fingers than almost any other piece of hardware in modern buildings. You're probably thinking, easy, it's broken. Elevators are old, maintenance is expensive, buildings cut corners. That's the obvious answer, and it would almost make sense if it weren't happening to nearly every elevator, in nearly every building, built after a specific point in time. Broken things fail randomly. This doesn't fail randomly. It fails almost universally, on a schedule that lines up suspiciously well with one very specific year. To understand what's actually going on, we have to go back to 1990, to a piece of legislation that had nothing to do with elevator buttons on the surface, and everything to do with them underneath. That year, the United States passed a sweeping piece of civil rights legislation guaranteeing access for people with disabilities in public spaces. Among its many provisions were detailed building codes, and buried inside those codes were new rules for elevator doors. Doors now had to remain fully open for a minimum amount of time, several seconds at least, with additional time added depending on how far someone would need to walk from a hallway call button to actually reach the elevator car. The goal was straightforward: give someone using a cane, a walker, or a wheelchair enough time to physically make it inside before the doors could legally begin closing. That single requirement, tucked into hundreds of pages of accessibility law, quietly rewired how nearly every elevator built afterward would behave. Before this law, the door close button generally worked the way you'd assume. Press it, and the elevator's control system would shorten the wait and start closing the doors right away. It was a simple, functional convenience for anyone in a hurry. But once the new minimum open time rules went into effect, elevator manufacturers faced a legal problem. If the closed door button still worked exactly as before, someone could, in theory, close the doors on a person who hadn't yet made it across the lobby, undermining the entire point of the accessibility requirement. The safest way to guarantee compliance wasn't to write clever new software that calculated exactly who was approaching and how fast. It was simpler and cheaper to just disconnect the button from anything meaningful during normal operation. So elevator control panels kept the button. They kept its shape, its icon, its satisfying little click when pressed. They just stopped wiring it to anything that mattered. Here's where it gets interesting, because the button didn't disappear, and that wasn't an oversight either. It stayed on nearly every panel for two very deliberate reasons that have nothing to do with the average rider in a hurry. The first reason is maintenance and emergency access. Elevator technicians need a way to control doors precisely while inspecting or servicing a car, often switching the elevator into a special inspection mode, where the same button suddenly does exactly what you'd expect, closing the door on command. Firefighters need something similar during emergency operation, when elevators switch into a distinct mode, allowing trained personnel to move cars through a building quickly, overriding the normal accessibility delay because saving lives takes priority over standard wait times. In both of these modes, that same triangle-shaped button that felt so useless a moment ago suddenly becomes fully functional, just not for you, and not during a normal ride. The second reason is almost entirely psychological, and it's the part that explains why removing the button altogether was never seriously considered. Riding in an elevator puts you in a small enclosed box, suspended by cables, moving through empty space inside a building, with no direct control over your own motion. That's an unusually vulnerable position for a human body to be in, and on some level, most people feel it, even if they'd never put it into words. Having a button to press, any button, creates a small illusion of agency inside that vulnerability. Studies on decision-making and control have shown repeatedly that people feel calmer and more satisfied in a situation, even a completely automated one, when they believe their actions are influencing the outcome, regardless of whether they actually are. Removing the button wouldn't have changed the door's closing speed by a single second. It would have removed a small, quiet comfort millions of people rely on without realizing it. There's another layer to this worth sitting with, because it explains why almost nobody ever questioned the button's existence in the first place. Elevators occupy a strange, quiet corner of everyday psychology that researchers have studied for decades, going back to observations of how strangers behave the moment those doors close. People instinctively turn to face the door, avoid eye contact, and fall silent, all without ever being told to. It's one of the most reliably predictable pieces of unspoken social behavior in modern life, and elevator designers have known for a long time that anything reducing the discomfort of that small shared box, even something as minor as a button to press, changes how a ride feels without changing anything about how it actually works. That's also why the button was never simply deleted once it stopped doing anything useful during a normal ride. Removing it outright would have been the honest engineering choice. It also would have been the wrong one, from a design standpoint, because it would have stripped away a small psychological anchor millions of daily riders lean on without ever noticing they're doing it. Keeping a button that quietly does nothing turned out to be cheaper, simpler, and more satisfying to the average rider than either fixing the wiring to comply with the new law or removing the button and admitting nothing was there to press at all. Pedestrian crossing buttons at busy downtown intersections were mostly disconnected decades ago, once cities switched to computer-controlled traffic timing, yet the buttons stayed bolted to the poles, still pressed by thousands of impatient walkers every single day. Office thermostats in large buildings are sometimes wired to nothing at all. Dummy units installed specifically because giving employees a dial to adjust, even a fake one, measurably reduced complaints about temperature compared to offices with no thermostat control at all. The elevator button belongs to the exact same quiet category of design. Not a lie exactly, but a deliberate decision that the appearance of control is sometimes worth more to people than the reality of it. That said, the story isn't quite as absolute as the popular version that spreads online every few years. The close door button hasn't vanished from elevator engineering entirely, and in some buildings, particularly older installations that predate the 1990 law or smaller residential elevators that fall outside certain code requirements, the button still does exactly what it says. The honest version of the story isn't the button is fake, it's that the button became legally required to do nothing during the specific window of time the accessibility law protects, and outside that narrow window, in older buildings, service modes, and emergency situations, it works exactly as advertised. The popular myth flattens a nuanced regulatory compromise into a simple conspiracy, which is a much more satisfying story to tell at a party than the real one involving building codes and liability. So, what if that 1990 law had never included a minimum open door time at all? Elevator manufacturers likely would have kept the close door button fully functional across the board, and millions of people over the following decades would have had one extra second or two shaved off their daily commute, at the direct cost of anyone needing a little more time to physically reach the doors before they slammed shut on them. The button you keep mashing out of habit exists in its current, mostly powerless state, specifically because someone, somewhere, decided that a few seconds of your convenience mattered less than someone else's ability to safely get inside. Remember that panel you've pressed 100 times without a second thought, convinced you were somehow speeding things along? It was never really broken. It was quietly reassigned, decades ago, to a much smaller job, giving you something to press, while a much bigger, much older piece of legislation quietly did the actual work of deciding how long that door stays open. So next time you're standing in an elevator, jabbing that button, while the doors take their sweet time anyway, remember what's actually happening. You're not controlling anything. You're participating in one of the most common, most invisible pieces of legal compromise in modern architecture, dressed up as a button, sitting quietly on nearly every elevator panel on the planet. You've pressed it 1,000 times. Now you know why.